Dear friends, welcome to yet another installment of Strategic Power. On Saturday, the Islamic State claimed responsibility for the devastating mass shooting in Moscow on Friday night. This came as somewhat of a surprise, if only because, at least for most Europeans, the Islamic State had stopped being a major problem by the late 2010s, after the international coalition against Daesh put an end to the caliphate established in Iraq and Syria in 2014. However, although the Islamic State no longer controls significant territory, and is now more of a standard terrorist network than the quasi-state it was in 2014, the group is nonetheless enjoying something of a resurgence at the moment, taking advantage of security vacuums in Afghanistan, Syria and Africa to re-establish itself as the world's preeminent Islamist terror group. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how the Islamic State has evolved over the past decade, its recent resurgence, and how the growing instability in the Middle East and the US's increasingly isolationist turn could fuel them further. But before we begin, if you haven't already, consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay up to date and get notified when we release new videos. So, let's start with a quick recap. After originating as a splinter from Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State emerged as a prominent force in the early 2010s, capitalizing on political instability in both Syria and Iraq, especially after the US withdrawal in 2011. The Islamic State enjoyed immense success, and at its peak in 2014 was more of a state than a terrorist group. They controlled a vast swathe of territory, which the Islamic State referred to as a caliphate, spanning around a third of Syria and close to 40% of Iraq, or around 250,000 square kilometers. This territory covered some relatively major cities, including Raqqa and Mosul, and at its height, close to 10 million people lived in Islamic State-controlled land. Within that territory, the Islamic State had its own Sharia-inspired ultra-conservative laws, and they were able to enforce those laws because no one else was strong enough to stand up to them. In other words, they had a monopoly on violence, which many sociologists, going back to Max Weber, have considered the defining characteristic of a state. In response to the rise of the caliphate in 2014, several international coalitions, comprising effectively every significant national military power, were organized to push the Islamic State back. By 2017, the Islamic State had lost 95% of its territory and its forces were significantly degraded. The Islamic State was fully ousted from Syria by early 2019, and the frequency of its attacks in Iraq fell 99% relative to 2014. However, in recent years, the Islamic State has experienced a partial resurgence in at least 3 places: Afghanistan, Syria, and Africa. In Afghanistan, the Islamic State Khorasan, frequently abbreviated to just ISIS-K, was able to take advantage of the Taliban's security shortcomings to establish a significant presence in the north of the country. For context, ISIS-K was formed in 2015 in Afghanistan as a splinter from the Pakistani Taliban and spent most of its existence attacking the Afghan Taliban for not being Islamist enough. Before the US withdrawal in 2021, US airstrikes and raids by Afghan Special Forces commandos kept ISIS-K contained in eastern Afghanistan. But since the Taliban takeover, ISIS-K has spread throughout the country. Initially, they limited their attacks to Taliban targets within Afghanistan, but in 2022 they began attacking foreign politicians and visitors in an attempt to sabotage the Taliban's ongoing efforts at diplomatic normalization. In 2022 alone, ISIS-K fighters attacked the Russian embassy in Kabul, attempted to assassinate Pakistan's top diplomats in Afghanistan, and stormed a Kabul hotel, popular with Chinese businessmen and officials. Although they don't control much territory, ISIS-K is now well entrenched in Afghanistan to the point of being able to carry out attacks abroad. Earlier this year, ISIS-K militias carried out a brutal suicide bombing in Iran during a commemoration for slain Revolutionary Guard commander Qasem Soleimani, and killed at least 43 people in an attack on a political rally in northern Pakistan last July. Just a day before Friday's attack near Moscow, ISIS-K carried out a suicide bombing in the Afghan city of Kandahar that killed at least 20 people, including several Taliban members. Revealingly, the Taliban themselves condemned the Crocus Hall attack on Sunday, saying in a statement, "We condemn, in the strongest possible terms, the recent terrorist attacks in Moscow and consider them a flagrant violation of all human standards." The Islamic State has also been making a slow but steady comeback in western Syria, establishing operational control from the Daraa Governorate and carrying out regular attacks in Homs province, and particularly around the ancient city of Palmyra, which was seized by the Islamic State in 2015. In January, for instance, around 25 Syrian soldiers were killed in 2 separate Islamic State attacks around Palmyra, and the overall frequency and intensity of Islamic State attacks in Syria increased considerably in 2023 and the first 2 months of 2024. This territory west of the Euphrates is normally under the control of Bashar al-Assad's government, backed by Russian forces, but their ability to contain the Islamic State has been limited both by Russia's military focus on Ukraine and the dismantling of the Wagner mercenary group, which previously represented a significant fraction of the overall Russian presence in Syria and was widely considered more effective than the standard Russian military. Russian fighter jets and attack helicopters, for example, were instrumental in pushing the Islamic State back in 2022, but are not being utilized as much as before, presumably because they are needed in Ukraine. Similarly, in Africa, Islamic State-affiliated groups were able to take advantage of political instability and the security vacuum in West Africa. The wave of military coups in the region is both a symptom and a cause here. In many cases, the militaries took power because they believed the governments were not adequately dealing with the Islamist threat. But so far, the new military regimes have had little more success, in part because many of them have ditched their former Western security partners like France and the US in favor of Russia and the Wagner Group. Unfortunately, for the reasons mentioned, Russia and the Wagner Group have not been as effective as hoped, and Islamic State operations in West Africa and the Sahel have expanded rapidly in recent years. What is particularly notable about the Islamic State's operations in Africa is the fact that they have been accompanied by territorial gains, akin to what we saw in 2014, specifically in parts of Mali, Mozambique, and Somalia. This is especially concerning because territorial control typically means more recruits, creating a dangerous positive feedback loop. Overall, while the Islamic State has moved away from being a quasi-state with contiguous, well-defined territory to become more of a classic terrorist network, it remains a serious and growing problem. To make matters worse, the ongoing escalating chaos in the Middle East, combined with the prospective full US withdrawal from Syria and Iraq, something the Iraqi government began calling for after Israel's invasion of Gaza, will only bring more opportunities for the Islamic State and other terrorists in the near future.